Bibles with you today, we're going to be turning to the book of Kings, 1 Kings. We're going to be looking at chapter 15. There's two verses that we're going to concentrate a little bit on today, and they are verses 11 and 14. Let's say, okay, so 1 Kings, chapter 15, verses 11 and 14. I don't know about you guys, and I don't know how many of you have kids, but as most of you know, I have 5 kids. And there's the age about 2 or 3 when kids begin to have like a lot of questions. As a matter of fact, they'll ask a question, and they'll say, well, why, Daddy? And then you'll answer something, and then again they'll say, why? And then you'll answer a question, and then they say, why? And then you'll answer that question, and it's like, why? And it's just continually going until you're like, can you just believe it, or can you just leave me alone? Like, I'm tired of answering the question why. But I read a recent article about sort of this subject, and it was from a psychologist who was asked by a mother, and the question was this: why does my toddler keep asking why? Which is actually funny to me because she's actually asking why, okay? He simply stated back to her, asking why can be viewed in the same way as saying no. It's your child's way of showing that she's developing an independent mind. While sometimes toddlers start asking why at about age 2 years, others begin much later. Your toddler is curious about the world and wants to learn. And she's starting to understand what we call cause and effect, or the idea that there is a reason for almost everything. Her questions are also a way for her to keep you chatting, to keep the conversation going. When you respond, try to explain your answer in a way that your toddler will understand. That way, she's less likely to get frustrated, and with any luck, she'll have learned something. I don't know about you, but when I get into the Bible and I begin to read through all these passages, and there's a lot of things like in Kings and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and all those things, I start reading and I start having like a lot of questions like, why did this happen? Or why was this the response? And even when I look at the life of Jesus, one of the questions I have is, Jesus, why would you leave heaven and come to earth with all of our sort of problems and issues? Why would you leave such a perfect place? I also can have questions like when I read in the Old Testament, there's a story about Elisha the prophet. And if you remember this story, there was a group of boys who were making fun of him being bald. And I guess he threw down a curse on them. And the next thing we know, they're being mauled by bears. Okay? And I kind of think, why did he do that? Or why was that allowed to happen? Because I'm like, I would really like to use that if I could. But I like to use it more with the height thing, because I get that a lot, you know? Or why did, for example, the story of Joseph. And Joseph had been thrown into prison when he did the right thing, and he left the room of his master's bride when she tried to come on to him. Why was he thrown into prison for that? And so I think we have a lot of questions why. My wife is one that, I love my wife completely, but she a lot of times has a lot of questions that she likes to ask. And some of the questions to me seem a little bit crazy, or I don't even know why she's asking them, but like we just got on vacation and we're driving, and my wife will say something like this, are you speeding? And I'm like, well, you just looked over at the speedometer, which is on my side of the car, so you know that I was, so why did you ask that? She sometimes has a problem with some of the outfits I wear, and because I tend to wear things until they're almost see-through, because they feel good, that you can finally breathe in them, And my wife she'll say something like, are you really going to wear that? And I say, well, I was going to, but if you prefer me to wear what I normally wear around the house, which is my Fruit of the Looms, I can do that, I guess. It would just be awkward when I got out there. Or she'll look at the food on my plate or something I have in my hand, and she'll say, should you be eating that? And I'm guessing from the tone of your voice, the answer is no. And maybe I shouldn't be. And then I always wonder, did she poison it? Is she trying to warn me? And then there's my favorite question. That she'll say, what do you think of this dress? Now, listen, you would think that answer that question is easy, but it's a little bit more difficult to answer than you think. I always feel like this is some sort of trap for me, like she's baiting me in some way. Because I know the answer really should be a positive one. Like, I get that. And by the way, my wife looks good in anything, okay? So I got that going for her. But I always seem like, even though I answer this question, I always feel like I get it wrong. Because she'll say, what do you think? What do you think of this dress? And I'll be like, yeah, it's okay. I see her face. I'm like, it's good. It's great. It's the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen in my 44 years on this earth. I have never seen anything as fantastic as that dress. And then she'll say something like, well, you messed up because I don't even like this or whatever, or she just it's one of those things like, okay, you don't know what you're talking about anyways, And so I always feel like I get sort of those questions wrong. But what I love about my wife is that even though I joke about her sort of the way she talks about clothes and outfits and that, she is one of the most thought-provoking people I know. She really spends time asking questions, and I love her because when we do devotions, or when she's reading her devotions, I'm reading mine, there'll be oftentimes that we'll sort of ask each other questions, or here's what I've been reading, what do you think about this? And I'll oftentimes sit down with my message and I'll say, hey, this is where I think I'm going with my message. What do you think about this? And she gives me answers, and we begin to sort things out. But this message today is, because my wife does her devotions nightly. And I would say daily, but let's face it, she is not a morning person like me, okay? She struggles with that. But she reads her devotions nightly. And she was reading this through the passage in Kings. And she was reading about these kings over and over again. And there were some things that she noticed that was going on in the lives of kings. There was a couple distinctions that were being made. And so my wife, who was basically inspired by God, she gave me some of these words. She says, I really think that you should preach a message on this subject sometime. And so the message today was basically given to me by my wife, is given to her by the Lord. And so I want to share that with you today. Well, we'll be looking at 1 Kings, and we'll be looking at chapter 15, verse 11. But I want to read you some other things as well. Because if you know anything about the way that the kings were, there was a king called Solomon who came after David, which we know Solomon to be the wisest man in the Bible. But after him, there was sort of these two kingdoms that were about at the time. And one was Israel and one was Judah. And they had these different kings, and they had the lineage go down. But there were certain distinctions that were made as the different kings were mentioned. So let me give you a couple of those verses and see if you recognize the distinction, okay? So this one is here. It says, Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It says, Nadab, son of Jeroboam, became king of Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of his father and committing the same sin his father had committed. We have still in chapter 15, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, son of Ahijah, became king of Israel in Tirzah, and he reigned 24 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the ways of Jeroboam and committing the same sin Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. And chapter 16, but Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord and sinned more than all those before him. Do you notice one of the distinctions that was being made about one of the kings there? It's what? They were doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. There's also other passages, and in some of the other passages what we read is this. We read that they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And so you have in the Kings is what's taking place is you have these sort of 19 kings of Israel, and all of them, when you read about them, they were considered evil in the eyes of the Lord. One king, Jehu, was sometimes okay, but he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Then there were the 20 kings of Judah, and 12 of them were evil. But then there were 8 of them that did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And so I want to give them props because I think they deserve their props for this. But here's the kings that were mentioned that did right in the eyes of the Lord. They were Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. Now, in saying that there were these 8 kings who did right in the eyes of the Lord, there was another distinction that my wife noticed as she was reading her devotions. And this was the other distinction. With Hezekiah and Josiah, it not only said that they did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but it said this, and they tore down the high places. That was the other distinction it made. It not only said that they did right and they were fully committed to Christ, but they said they went above and beyond that, and they got rid of the high places. So the passage of Scripture I want to get in before we get into it is from 1 Kings 15:11, which says this. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. And then in verse 14 it says this. Although he did not remove the high places, Asa's heart was fully committed to the Lord all of his life. Let's pray together. Father God, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the value that there is in it. We think way back to all these historical accounts that took place and recognize, Father, that these are examples for us to see how that when people followed you, society did well. And when people turned their back on you, society had issues and problems. And not that everything's perfect, but Father, there's something to be said about following a God that we love and the God that loves us. So help us today to recognize your word. In your name we pray. Amen. So the secondary distinction was that of high places. As my wife shared about this to me, I was sort of blown away with it. I was like, man, that's really good stuff. And I wonder, I just started asking all these questions myself. So even though, like I was talking earlier about how kids have questions why, there are times when I come to the scriptures and I start to ask why and what and how and who and all these things. And so I know that we could go over this passage of scripture, and I know that all of you could probably add to the questions I have. But for the purpose of this message, I want to look at 4 questions about high places. So first question would be this. What are high places? What are the high places? Literally speaking, high places were hilltops where people offered sacrifices. So they would go into a community and they would find sort of the highest place, and they would find this high place and they would take the animals and they would go up there and sacrifice on these places. Now the reason why they would climb up these very high places is to be what? They wanted to be closer to God. Now in this case, it was a lot of man-made gods. It wasn't like the God that we follow, which is the great I am, or the only God, or we follow one God. They would climb these mountains in order to meet with the gods or the different people. And one of the issues was, and this is how you know that there's a problem, they basically created their God to be human. Okay? He was a human creation. Why was he a human creation? The idea that you have to climb up a mountain to be near a God is a human limitation we put on people. The idea that we have to climb up on a mountain because our God's ears are limited, and the only way that he can hear us is that we get closer to is limiting their gods. Now what we would say about our God is this. Our God can hear us wherever we are. He can hear us as we even whisper. Not only can he hear us when we whisper, but our God can even hear our inner thoughts. It's not a limiting of the power of God, but we're exalting and we believe that he is all-powerful, he is all-knowing, and he is all-seeing. We're not limiting God. So they would create these high places where they could meet with God and they could sacrifice to gods. They were limiting their God because he was human creation. Now, not only were they making him human creation, but the sin in the world had gotten so bad, and a lot of the sins, and a lot of the sins even today, are pretty sexual in nature. And so what they would do on these high places or these hilltops, they would build what they call Asherah poles. And for the purpose of our audience, I won't get into what an Asherah pole is, but it is sexual in nature. Okay? And they would bow down before these Asherah poles and they would worship them. And not only would they worship these Asherah poles, but they would also set up these temples, and those were what was considered the high places. And in these temples is where they would offer their sacrifices. And listen to this. The temples had gotten so corrupt in that society sexually that they would have prostitutes that people could come in and meet with, and they believed that that was some spiritual act of worship that they would do. And so these high places were just detestable before God. Matter of fact, when God refers to the high places, and I don't want to get into like a chauvinistic thing, but what would happen is when God refers to the high places here, he refers to it in the feminine form. Okay, the high places are in the feminine form. When he refers to his temple, which he calls, by the way, temple in the Old Testament, if you look at it, is called the Lord's house. The Lord's house is actually in the masculine form. In the masculine form, always in the Bible, was to denote that it was superior over a feminine form, okay? And again, I'm not trying to say that, men are much better than women. I'm just dictating with the Bible how they sort of lay it out. And so what God was saying is, listen, my place of worship should always be the highest place of worship. instead of these high places that you've created. So the high places were these places that people could just meet with sort of these false gods, and they could do this false sort of worship. Now, what those high places for me represent is this, is they represent sort of a standard in society at that time. And what I mean is, they represent that the people felt like they needed some other form of God to worship, that they wanted to do all this junk, and so they created a God that would allow them to do the junk that they wanted. And so they created this God. I had the opportunity and a great time of my wife when we first got married. I don't even know how long we were into our marriage, but her family decided that we were going to go on a family reunion with the extended family of my father-in-law. And my father-in-law, before we went on this vacation, he said, Chuck, there's 2 rules when you're on vacation here with my family. I said, okay, I think I can handle 2 rules and remember them. He said, the 2 rules are this. We don't talk about politics, and we don't talk about religion. Because they were sort of on a sort of different side of things. I said, okay, I can handle that. Well, man, I stepped into it super quick. All right, because we had our first meal together, and I don't know how it happened, but all of my immediate family that I knew got up from the table and left, and it was just me and sort of the extended family who I did not know yet. And I was sitting at the table, and Rachel's great uncle, he said, so, Chuck, what do you do for a living? And I was thinking, oh man, do I lie? Or, what do I do? And I said, I'm a minister. And this always happens. Whenever people find I'm a minister, either they start to get their act together, or they want to tell me about how spiritual they are. And so he began to explain to me, yeah, we attend church a lot, and it's a great thing and all this. And then he started posing some questions to me that I knew that I was stepping into it at this point. But he was talking to me about how that the pastor of their church was a lesbian and wanted to know, what does my denomination, Wesleyan Church, think about that? And I was like, uh-oh, here we go. And so I explained our viewpoint, which, by the way, and I don't want this to be the message, but the viewpoint from our perspective is it's just like any other sexual sin, and it's listed among the sexual sins as well. I think sometimes we focus on it more than the others, but just like it's wrong to sleep around with somebody else, it's also a sexual sin. Like I think we have bents to doing certain things. I think some people are more bent to homosexuality than others, but I think some people are more bent to cheating on their spouses than others as well. Okay, but it's all within that same confines. So he said, Chuck, where do you get this from? So then I began to talk to him about different passages. I began to talk about the passage in Leviticus where it says, man shouldn't sleep with women shouldn't sleep with women, and it's an abomination before the Lord. And so I told him that. And then I told him, I quoted to him a passage in Romans where it says, and the Lord gave them over to their sinful desires and began to sleep with men and women with women and all that stuff. Talked about Sodom and Gomorrah and all these things. So now here's where I want to go, because that's not what I want to focus on, I hope you know. And I can do that in another message sometime. Here's where I want to focus. At the end of saying all that, here's what he said to me that just sort of stopped me in my tracks. At the end of that, he said to me, oh, so you have a biblical view. And I thought, is there another view? Or like, I literally, it just stopped me because I'm thinking that there's some other view. And what he was saying is, and what he was referring to is, for him, going to church is more of a social activity. And it's what society puts as its standard. And here's what I want you to know. The distinguishing factor that they're trying to make in this passage is this, is that it's not about what society thinks is right, but it's about what? It's about the Lord's. And that's why we're given this passage in 11. They did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Like that's the standard. That's the thing that separates me from other people. And so when I'm having a discussion with him, I can no longer have a discussion on sort of the issue of the sin. We're having now a discussion about if the Bible is right or wrong, or if the Bible exists. And I can't even figure out why you would go to church if you didn't believe in the Bible. And some of you may leave after that, But I can't even understand that. But here's what I know. I know that the enemy is so tricky and vicious that he will try to do everything he can to destroy Christianity. And what we have going on here is it's one high place, other gods, versus another high place, which is our God. Now, if you know anything about like military strategies, one of the strategies that you want to get is you want to have the high place, right? Especially in the Bible times. Because if you could build a fortress on a high place, then the invading army, they would have to climb that mountain and you'd be shooting down or throwing tar or whatever on them, you know. But you'd be throwing things down at them, and they would have to get up there and they would have to climb up things and get above the walls in order to get into the fortress, and that's what we would do. Now, even in our society, even today, there is something about having the higher superiority, so that planes and jets with the bombers and stuff, that is, we want air superiority, don't we? I mean, that's what we want. Now, in order to destroy something that has superiority, is, you know, like a fortress or even the air defense of what we have, what you want to do is you want to strike them at their foundations, right? You want to strike them at their foundations. Because if you can strike them at their foundations, then you can get in and you can take over the place. Or even in air superiority, what you'd want to do is you would want to take out the planes before they even take off, or you would want to jam their frequencies and stuff so that they couldn't communicate with one another to know where they should go next. And so you would sort of take all that away. This is where the enemy is very tricky. Because what he wants us to do is he wants us to believe that the Bible is incorrect. And then once we believe the Bible is incorrect, guess what? We have no standard anymore. Who decides the standard? Society. And what we've seen over and over again in biblical times and even our day and age is that society gets it wrong. Now, why does society get it wrong? Because we want to justify our sin. We want to make God into our image instead of letting God be the standard. So those high places then, those high places are anything that we put above God. And they represent anything that we would elevate before God. So let's think about this for a minute in our own circumstances. What would those high places be for us today? So for some of you, maybe the high places are work. Maybe for you, it's like, I need to do work, I need to provide for my family. And not that work's bad, because you're still a Christian like Asa, but the problem is that work is coming before everything else. Work is coming before your kids, coming before your family, or work is coming before your time in the church or with God. And so maybe that's a problem. For some of you, it could be even simple things like here in the church. Maybe your high places are the type of worship that we do. Whether you like hymns or whether you like choruses, either way. Some of you like one over the other. But if you're saying that the other one's wrong, that's a problem. That's a high place for you. Matter of fact, a high place could even be like this pulpit. And I got to tell you, I've been eyeing it a little bit. And the reason why I've been eyeing it is if you see the way I do my messages, I have all these notes here. I have a pen, I have my Bible, and then I have this bottle of water. And this bottle of water doesn't really sit on this pulpit too well, okay? I would really like something that would stand up and it would be open already. And so for me, I think, boy, I'd really like to have a table. But some of you would be like, oh, Pastor Chuck, we don't get rid of the pulpit. That's like sacred. All right, that's sacred. And for some of you, that really is sacred. You know, you would have a problem if I brought a table up here and that's where I laid my stuff, because that would be too sacred for you. You know, but the funny thing is we don't do a lot of things like the way they did in the early church. You know, because one of the things they used to do in the early church, which I actually believe we should go back to, because there was one time I had a seat up here because I couldn't walk on my leg. I don't know if you remember that. But some people were like, oh, Chuck, I don't know if you should have a seat up there because pastors are not supposed to sit. Okay, let me give you some church history. Pastors used to be the only ones that sat, and the congregation would stand. All right, so could you imagine, you would stand for like an hour, and I'd be sitting there being like, oh, we having struggles? You know, like, I'm just sitting down, enjoying my time. I got all your attention. And listen, the funny reason, you know why they went to seat, to having people sit? Because they used to have people that would come and pickpocket people. And so that way you could sit on your wallet, you know, and guard your money. And so that was the reason why they sort of flipped it over, okay? So there are some of those high places that we have. For some of you, it could be relationships that you have. There is this one friend that you don't want to let go, but they may be toxic to you. Or maybe for some of you, it's that flirtatious relationship you have with someone that isn't your spouse. And maybe you're just sort of holding on to that high place because they make you feel good or feel better about yourself. For some of you, it could be social activities. It could be things like the clubs, or it could be like a big thing in our day and age, and a thing we struggle through in our family is sports. And whenever we place sports above the church or above God, I think that that's an issue. I have no problem with that stuff. I just think it's an issue if we elevate it above God. And then for some of you, it could just even be your attitude. Maybe you've grown up in a situation to where you were taught a certain way. Some of you could have been sort of in negative experiences where your family has hardly been positive ever, and that negativity has just been with you. And you know it's a problem. You know it's a high place in your life, but you struggle to get rid of it, and so it sort of holds on to your life. Whatever those things are that we elevate above God, those are those high places that we need to get rid of. Second question I had is this: why do the high places remain? And the reason why the high places remain is because the kings were afraid to tear down those high places. And one of the reasons why they were afraid to tear down those high places is because these high places represented people's past. Like, there was a lot of those people who had set up and built those temples and had poured money, sweat, and tears toward it in these buildings that they had. So when you want to get rid of them, they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. This is what we created. We don't get rid of these places. And the problem is that their past was holding on to them and they couldn't let it go. I think for some of us, and there's a passage, by the way, I want to read to you in Galatians chapter 4, verse 8 through 11. It says this: formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you're turning your back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. And this is Paul, who is beginning to talk to the people and say, look, there are things in your past that you are holding on to, and you need to let them go because they are destroying you, or they are setting you up for failure in the future. And let's be honest, I don't know how many times that I've seen people not accept Christ because they look at their past and say this: my past is so sinful or so evil that there is no way that God can ever forgive me. Now, who wrote this passage again, by the way? This was Paul. And Paul was formerly known as Saul, who persecuted or even witnessed Christians being killed. And yet God got a hold of Saul's life, and now most of the New Testament is written by him. That's the difference that God can make. He can change you. But there are other things that we sometimes hold in our past. There are situations that have been beyond our control where we have been abused in some way, and the problem is we have been so sort of like that's our identity that we can't let it go, and it is still holding on to us today to where we can't get past it. And the truth is, we need to let go of those high places because your identity is not in them. Your identity is in God. That's who your identity is. There are people that have addictions, and there's substances that they have turned to. There are people that have struggled with pornography, and they are willing to trade 5 minutes or an hour of pleasure for those things that they're willing to trade it for the things that really have long-term or eternal value. We're willing to trade those things of pleasure for just those moments. What's happening is they value the past and the present more than they value their future. I think that there are relationships that have been in our past that are controlling us that we need to let go. I think one of the things that we're struggling with, by the way, as Christians in society is this too, is I think we're struggling with the fact that when we call ourselves Christians, people think we're small-minded and we're ignorant. And they say, well, how can you believe that way when society believes this? And they're putting us down. And so sometimes we're afraid to tell people that we've accepted a new life in Christ, and so we're still holding on to the past. Why? Because those past relationships, for some of us, are mattering more than our relationship with God. And those are those high places that we need to get rid of. Pastor Dave gave an interesting message that I thought was good this week. He was giving it for the funeral of Junior. And one of the things he said because Christians or non-Christians will say sometimes, well, you Christians live too much by faith. And Pastor Dave's statement was this: don't we all live by faith in most of what we do anyways in life? I mean, every time I turn on or flip a light switch on, what do I think is going to happen? I believe that the light's going to come on. You know, every time I take a breath, I believe that there's going to be air for me to breathe. Every time I get in the car and go out there to drive, I have faith that some of you are just as good as drivers as me, and so we won't collide with each other. You know, so there's all sort of circumstances in life that we believe in. So why is it hard that I can believe in a God that I cannot always see, that I can see his work at hand in creation and his work in the lives of people and the changing that he does? Third question I had to ask myself is this: who did the high places hurt? Who did the high places hurt? The first person hurt is this: it hurt God. God, in the book of Exodus, before he's given the people the 10 Commandments, what he says is this. He says, I am a jealous God. In other words, I want your love and I want your attention. And most of us can understand that, and even most of us as kids, we always wanted the love of our parents, right? And if they didn't show us the most love, it was just like, oh, wait a minute, they should love me the most, you know? And our spouses feel the same way. And God was saying, look, I love you. And I'm a jealous God. I don't want you to have to turn to all these other high places, but I want you to turn to me. Because I'm the one that's going to sustain you. I'm the one that loves and that I care for you. And then when he goes on to give us the 10 Commandments, watch those first 4 commandments, because they're all about the way we love God. The first one says, love the Lord your God, right? The second then says, have no other gods before me. In other words, I want to be first. I don't want you to turn to these other things. I want to be the primary source of love. And then the third one says, do not misuse God's name. And then the fourth one is have a Sabbath day. Have a holy day, a day set apart where you rest and you spend time with God. And so when you go to these other high places or when you spend time with them, then what it says to God is, God, you're not as important to me as these high places in my life. And God says, no, no, no. Get rid of those high places. I want to be the highest place in your life. Secondly, it hurt this. It hurt the kings. And what I mean by that is the kings were in such a position that they were able to do great things. And so they walked in the ways of the Lord. But what would happen sometimes is as they would walk in the ways of the Lord and as they would build new places and the people would experience all this goodness, the people would constantly go up to the kings and say, oh, how great you are, kings. You guys are the best. And what would happen is their pride would get in the way. And so every once in a while they would quit turning to God and they would say, well, I know what's best to do because I have the praise of the people and I'm doing what's right and look at me. And I have to confess something to you, and I was talking to my wife about this week. But even as a minister, there are times I have to watch my pride and my arrogance. The last couple times I've preached, I've gotten a pretty good response from people. And they'll say, oh, Pastor Chud, that was just a great message and I really enjoyed it. And they're sharing it and people are viewing it on YouTube and all that. And it's funny because after I got done with my last message, and Rachel will tell you this last week, she said, how do you think I did? Or she said, how do you think you did? And I said, terrible. I said, it was awful. I was like, I have no business even preaching this message. I mean, just really, she'll tell you, wasn't that the truth? And she's like, oh, I thought it was good. I thought, you know, and all this. I'm like, yeah, you're just my wife. You're just saying that because you have to, you know, because you have to go home to me. But then after people started telling me, I started feeling better about myself. I started feeling like, wow, look at me. You know, I must have did something good. And what I realized is this, because I started thinking about it. As a matter of fact, I'm even having my professor look at one of my messages because I'm like, I don't think I've done anything differently. The only thing I've done differently is this, though. I've committed myself to coming here and praying on a daily basis that God would intervene and you would hear his voice and not mine. And so there's nothing to get prideful about because it's God speaking into your lives. But could you see where pastors can get in trouble too? Like all of a sudden we think it's about me. And here's what happens is I become a showman then. And then here's what happens. I begin to tell you things that you want to hear instead of things you need to hear. And I want God to be able to take this vessel and say, you know what, Chuck? This is the word that I want my people to hear. And now, no matter how hard it may be for them to hear, you proclaim truth. And so pride can get in the way. And so it can affect the kings, the people in leadership, which then in turn affects this. The third is the people. I want to read to you a passage in 1 Corinthians 10:23 and through 24. It says, and this is Paul again speaking. Paul says, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. You see, people don't always know what's best for them. So in this case, they continue to go to the high places. What the king should have did is the king should have got rid of the high places. Why? Because when they kept those high places up, what the kings were in essence saying is, these things are still valuable. These are still places that you can turn to when you need help. That's what the kings were saying. If the kings would have destroyed them, what they would have said is, these things are worthless, they're valueless, they're corruptive, and we need to get rid of them. But they kept those places up. And I have to think in my own life that there are times when there are things that we can do, but they're not really beneficial. So for example, my kids can eat all the candy they want. They can do that, right? As a matter of fact, when they go to the grandparents, that's what they do. All right? They get a lot of that stuff. All right? But from our perspective, my wife, she's like, not all candy. You're going to have to eat, and I mentioned this earlier, and I don't know if I explained it right, but my wife is big on the kids eating peppers, like the red bell peppers or the yellow peppers. And by the way, I hate all those peppers, okay? But my kids act like they're candy sometimes, like, oh, a pepper. And I'm like, are you guys messed up? Like, it's so good. Like, that's a pepper. Like, I wouldn't eat that, you know? And so, but they feel like it's candy. But what she's trying to say is, look, I understand that you guys can have all the candy you want, maybe throw up later, but it's not really beneficial to you. But these peppers are probably better for you in some way, and they are. But there are other things in life that we can do, but they're not necessarily beneficial to us. And so we can take things like, for me, and this is where I struggle with sometimes, but there are certain shows that I watch that my kids wouldn't have a good understanding of. And if they heard those shows, they would think that daddy was okay with some things, and they would think that certain things are okay in society and all that. But there are things that I can't watch in front of my kids, right? Because they would think that those things are okay. So there are times I have to evaluate the things that I look at or watch or listen to. You know, I don't know how many times I listen to sports radio and don't think anything about it. Then all of a sudden, man, I got some kids in my car, and, you know, there might be a cuss word or there might be some innuendo, and I'm like, oh, no, we got to go. You know, can't listen to that. Because why? Because I don't want it to affect my kids in a negative way. There are relationships that we sometimes have to get out of because they're hurting people around us. And so we can't be around those people because of the things that they're saying or the things that they're doing, and they hurt us. There is the time that I spend at work. And if I spend too much time at work, it can affect my kids because my kids want me to be home. On one side, we can say, well, you know, going to work is actually very beneficial. Why? Because we need the money and I need to provide for my kids. But you know what my kids are saying a lot of times? Is, Dad, you don't have to spend all the time at work. Because I don't really care as much about the money as I care about the time. One of the things that I loved about my parents, and I don't know if this is completely true or not, but I never remember my parents missing a game or an activity I was involved in. I just remember them being at all my stuff. Now, I was their favorite child, and so they may have not did it for the rest of the kids, but they at least did it for me. But those things were valuable, and they're still things that I remember today, because what they did is they said, you're more important than the work out there. For some of you, it can be busyness just in general. For some of you, it can just be, like we talked about too, the attitude of the negativity that can just take over your life, and you can just be negative about everything. I don't know how many times, even at work here, that I've walked around a corner, and every once in a while you'll hear a staff person sort of talk negatively about one of the other staff people, and they'll talk about it to people in the congregation, and it always bothers me, because I think, what value is there in that? What is that really helping? You know? Do people come away and say, boy, thanks for putting down the other staff person? Now I know to watch out. And so I won't be listening to that person share about God anymore. Is that really beneficial to us? You can say those things, but is it beneficial? No. What we should do is be building one another up and realizing we're a team. And if we have problems, just go to that person, you know? Because that's the things we need to be careful about. So anyways, you get the point of that. I think we need to be careful what things that we do that can hurt others. So, how do we tear down the high places? First of all, I would say this. I think we need to build boundaries. Anytime that you have a teenage daughter, especially a daughter, I would say, but you know you're going to put up boundaries, right? You know, you will not be alone with that guy in that car, and you will not be at his house alone unless his family is there, and I'm going to call and check in on you, and you know, I'm going to put GPS devices on you, and I'm going to call cellular places, and I'm going to know where you're at every minute of the day. You know? Like you would put boundaries on there and say, you got to be in by this time or these things will happen. We know that even with kids, we'll put boundaries around our properties if we live in town near a road. Because we'll put fences up. Why? Because we want to protect our kids and make sure that they don't go out into the street and get hit by a car. Right? Like, and those things all make sense. So sometimes we have to put up boundaries. But I think there are other issues in our life that we need to put boundaries up. Like, for example, I think even in our marriages, I think we got to make sure that we don't use the word divorce. I think we just have to realize that we got to make this thing work. Like, we're committed to one another, so let's make it work. And it's like they've had those marriage conferences, don't put the D word on the table. In other words, don't put divorce on the table. And it's not an issue. And that's something that I really respect about me and my wife. But there are other issues that we have to watch out. I have to watch out for the things that I say to other people, the things that can be damaging. Like, it's okay to have arguments with one another, but we can't be destructive in what we're saying about them personally. We can't use words like, you're an idiot, you're stupid, or any of that stuff. We have to make sure that we're just arguing points and giving perspectives instead of attacking character and other things, because those things can be damaging. So we need to set boundaries so that we don't fall into those traps. There's a passage in Matthew chapter 5, verse 29 that I have quoted to memory, but it says this: if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away, because it is better for you to lose your eye than for your whole body to go into hell. And what that verse is actually talking about, it's talking about the idea of lust. And what it's saying is, look, if your body, if your eye is going to cause you to lust after somebody, then physically, like, take your eye out. And is that what he was really referring to, like physically take your eye out? No, what he was talking about is tear things down that would bring you to sin. So in other words, there are certain things that I might tear down in my life. I might tear down, for example, if I struggle with pornography, I may make sure that for me, I may not even have to have a computer because it's such an issue. I might have to tear those things down. There are times that I cannot watch the TV unless my wife is there, because why? Because I want to tear those things down. I want to make sure I don't get into that stuff. There are certain relationships that I might have to get rid of because they are negative and they are causing me to sin in some way. So I have to get rid of those relationships. I feel sorry for this one individual. There's a friend of mine who has gotten himself into trouble with alcoholism and has just been a drunk for a while. What's really bothered me is this, is that he has been willing to give up alcohol, but his spouse is not. And the problem is what? Is that spouse still having alcohol in the house is still a issue for that other person, isn't it? And I think you cannot give that up for the security of your spouse. Man, that's ridiculous. I had to tell you though, I was really impressed there, and I'm not going to use the name because I thought it was a great story. But I was told the other day of a couple in the church where the husband had some problem with alcohol. And here's what the wife did. The wife said, you know what? I'm not going to drink anymore because I know it's a problem for you. That's tearing something down for the benefit of somebody else. And that's what I love. So what kind of things do we need to tear down in our own lives in order that we might elevate God? The answer to all these questions is this. The answer to this question is we cannot put anything, nothing above God. God has to be first in our life. I'm going to ask you for a moment, and we're going to get into something else here in a little bit, but could you just bow your head and close your eyes for a minute? And I want to ask you this question. For you, if there are certain high places that you have elevated above God, and you would say, Pastor Chuck, could you just remember me in your prayer today? Because there are some things I'm struggling with. If you would just either wave your hand or look up at me, I just want to remember you in my prayers. So would you do that? Got it, back here in the back. Got it. Got it up here in the front. Got it. Right here in the middle. Yep, got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it over here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Got you on the side there and there. Got it. Thank you in the back there. Thank you over there. Thank you. All right. Thank you up front here. Thank you. And I'm probably not seeing all the hands and all the eyes, but I want to say this, is that God has the ability to forgive. Let me pray for you real quick before we get into one other thing this morning. Father God, for those people this morning that said, you know what, there are some high places that I built up in my life that I need to turn over to you. I pray that you would just help them through those. What I love about this passage is this. Asa, even though he didn't get rid of the high places, was still considered to be a man of God, which means he did right in the eyes of the Lord, which means he was guaranteed heaven. Father, help us to be people that can be more like you and are willing to give up more things because we don't want them to hinder our relationship with you. I thank you for those people who've just made a commitment, and even those who may have still struggling in their heart saying, Lord, I want to give this over to you. May you meet with them now, because I think that these things are important. In your name we pray. Amen. Before we dismiss today, here's the cool thing. Why is this stuff important? Why do we need to get rid of the high places? Because God matters. And not only does God matter, but the next generation matters as well, doesn't it?